When people in Tehran woke up and started talking about black rain, it sounded at first like the kind of phrase that spreads online faster than the facts. But this story did not begin as rumor. It began with fuel depots on fire, thick black smoke hanging over a city of nearly 10 million people, and residents saying the air had become hard to breathe. That is where we need to start. Not with the loudest headline, not with the most dramatic theory, with what is actually confirmed. Overnight strikes hit multiple fuel and petroleum-related sites in and around Tehran. After the fires burned for hours, huge columns of black smoke spread across the capital. Residents described soot, oily residue, darkened cars, and rain that appeared black or stained by fallout from the smoke. Iranian relief and health officials then warned people about the risks from contaminated air and rainfall. So the real question is not whether this looks apocalyptic on camera. The real question is what happens to a city when fuel storage burns at scale, smoke settles over neighborhoods, and ordinary people do not know whether the air, the rain, or even the surfaces around them are safe. That is the story. And it matters far beyond one viral image. Because once a fire like this starts, the crisis stops being only military. It becomes environmental, medical, logistical, and psychological all at once. The first thing to understand is that the phrase black rain is doing two jobs at the same time. It describes what people say they saw, but it also risks confusion if it is used carelessly. We should be precise here. What residents reported was dark, soot-heavy, oil-tainted rainfall, and residue after smoke from burning fuel sites spread over the city. In other words, the fear is not some mysterious science fiction event. The fear is that smoke, ash, hydrocarbons, and chemical pollutants from the fires mixed into the air and then came back down over urban areas. That is serious enough on its own. You do not need to exaggerate it to understand why people were alarmed. If smoke from burning fuel contains toxic particulates, sulfur compounds, nitrogen oxides, and other pollutants, then rainfall moving through that plume can pick up contamination. That can mean dirty residue on buildings, cars, streets, skin, clothing, and potentially in soil and water pathways too. And even before the rain falls, the smoke itself can create immediate breathing problems, especially for children, older adults, and people with asthma or other respiratory conditions. That is why reports from Tehran were so striking. People were not just saying the sky looked dark. They were saying daily life suddenly felt unsafe. A short drive with the windows closed felt irritating. Eyes burned. Throats felt raw. Cars and surfaces appeared coated. And in a city that large, those fears spread fast because nobody can instantly tell how local the danger is, how long it will last, or whether the worst is already over. The second thing to understand is why this particular target set matters so much. A strike on a fuel depot is not only about fuel, it is about what fuel touches. Fuel powers transportation, fuel supports emergency response, fuel links supply chains, fuel affects commuting, deliveries, power backup, and basic urban continuity. So even if the stated military rationale is that the facilities support state or military logistics, the urban consequence is rarely limited to a single fenced compound. When major storage and refining points burn near a capital, the effect spills outward. It moves through the air first, then through traffic, routine, shortages, fear, and public behavior. That is exactly why these images hit so hard. The smoke was visible, the fallout was visible, and the city itself became part of the story. According to reports, among the sites targeted were the Shahran oil depot, the Agdassieh oil warehouse, an oil refinery in the south, and facilities in Karaj, west of the capital. Israeli officials said the strikes hit fuel storage complexes they described as linked to the IRGC and used to distribute fuel to military entities. That is the official justification. But on the ground, the visible outcome was not some sterile military scene. It was a civilian megacity covered by smoke from burning fuel infrastructure. And that gap matters, because one of the biggest mistakes in conflict coverage is treating infrastructure as if it exists in isolation. It does not. Infrastructure sits near people, around people, inside the rhythm of people's lives. Roads, depots, power links, water systems, airports, refineries, and storage tanks all sound abstract until they are damaged. Then suddenly they become personal. That is when a war story changes shape. It is no longer just about who hit what. It becomes about who has to breathe near it, drive past it, wash it off, explain it to children, or leave town because the air feels wrong. And that is why this story has gotten so much attention. Not because smoke over a city is new in wartime, but because this particular smoke triggered a new kind of fear. Not only fear of another strike, but fear that the environment itself had turned hostile. Now, there is a temptation in moments like this to rush toward the most extreme conclusions. To say the entire city has been poisoned. To claim every drop of rain is chemically dangerous. To treat every dramatic image as proof of the worst-case scenario. That is not what we should do. The safer and more accurate way to frame this is, residents reported black or oil-stained rain and widespread soot. Iranian authorities and the Red Crescent warned that the smoke and rainfall could be acidic or contaminated and could pose risks to the skin and lungs. And the visible conditions on the ground show a major urban pollution event after strikes on fuel sites. That is already a very serious story. And it is stronger because it stays within what can actually be supported. This is also where the political dimension becomes impossible to ignore, because even according to Axios, the strikes reportedly caused concern inside the United States. U.S. officials, according to that reporting, worried the breadth of the fuel site attacks could backfire strategically by rallying Iranians around the government rather than weakening it, while also spooking oil markets. One source described the U.S. reaction in blunt terms. The reported message was essentially, why did this go this far? That point is important for two reasons. First, it suggests disagreement not over whether there is a war, but over what kind of targets actually help. And second, it highlights a long-standing lesson in conflict. When attacks hit infrastructure used by ordinary people, the military logic can become politically messy very quickly. Because what is the actual effect? Does it reduce military capacity in a meaningful way? Maybe. Does it also produce fear, disruption, anger, and environmental fallout in a dense civilian area? Clearly, yes. And once those two realities exist at the same time, the narrative becomes contested immediately. One side says these were military-linked fuel sites. The other side says this is collective punishment by another name. Residents, meanwhile, are not arguing theory. They are wiping soot off balconies and trying to figure out whether the next rainfall is safe. That human level is what gives this story its power. A lot of war coverage becomes trapped in maps, strategy, and official statements. But the real measure of escalation is often simpler. It is whether ordinary routines still work. Can people go outside? Can they drive without headaches? Can children be sent to school? Do people trust the rain? Do they know whether to stay or leave? When those questions enter the picture, the impact is no longer remote. It is intimate. And that is one reason fuel fires are so destabilizing in urban settings. They are visible, lingering, and hard to mentally compartmentalize. A missile strike may last seconds. Smoke hangs for hours. Soot lingers longer. The suspicion of contamination lasts longer still. Even people who were not physically close to the fire begin to wonder what drifted into their district, onto their car, onto their windows, onto their skin. That uncertainty changes behavior. You close the windows, you cancel the outing, you keep kids indoors, you delay travel, you look up, you check your throat, you watch the weather forecast like it is now part of the war. That is what infrastructure strikes can do in a city. They turn ordinary systems into sources of anxiety. And Tehran is especially vulnerable to that kind of psychological spillover because it is not a small industrial zone. It is a vast urban center with millions of residents, dense traffic, existing air quality sensitivities, and limited room for calm separation between target area and civilian area once smoke spreads. The environmental history here also matters. We have seen before what happens when oil-related fires burn at scale. The 1991 Gulf War left a lasting image of blackened skies and severe environmental damage after oil wells were set ablaze. Years later, burning oil fields in Iraq produced months of dark smoke and major health concerns. The lesson from those episodes is not that every case is identical. It is that oil fires do not stay inside the neat boundaries imagined in military briefings. They create moving, dirty, unpredictable consequences that can outlive the strike itself. That is why language matters so much now. If you understate this, you miss the real public health risk. If you overstate it, you slide into panic and lose credibility. The middle path is the right one. The smoke is real. The fallout appears real. The risks are serious enough for public warnings. And the full environmental and medical picture may take time to assess. That is the responsible frame. There's another angle here that should not be missed. Strikes like this do not only damage sites, they test resilience. How fast can emergency crews respond? How fast can officials communicate clearly? How much trust do residents place in public guidance? Can transport still function? Will fuel distribution be disrupted? How long will the air remain poor? Will rain worsen cleanup or spread contamination? Those are the questions that determine whether an infrastructure strike becomes a temporary shock or a deeper urban crisis. And by that measure, the Tehran story is significant because it appears to have crossed a threshold. It was not just another headline about an exchange of fire. It forced a conversation about air, water, surfaces, health, and daily survival inside the capital. That is a different level of public pressure. It also creates a different kind of image war. One side can publish a statement about targeting fuel linked to military consumers. The other side can point to blackened streets, coated cars, and people saying the air is unbreathable. In modern conflict, both images matter. But for global public opinion, the second image often travels faster, because smoke over a city communicates instantly. You do not need to know the name of the depot. You do not need to follow the military briefings. You only need to see daylight turned dark and hear people say, the rain no longer feels like rain. That is what makes this moment so potent. It compresses strategy, environment, and civilian fear into one visual frame, and it may already be influencing how allies view the campaign. If the Axios reporting is right, U.S. officials are worried not only about escalation, but about the strategic wisdom of hitting infrastructure that visibly affects ordinary people. That reflects a broader dilemma in modern warfare. Even when infrastructure has military relevance, attacking it can produce civilian suffering that changes the political meaning of the strike. In some cases, that pressure is intended. In other cases, it is an accepted side effect. Either way, once millions of people see black smoke over a capital, the distinction becomes harder to defend in public. That is why this story should be watched carefully in the next few days, not just for more strikes, for three other things. First, what do health authorities say next? Do they continue warning people to remain indoors? Do they identify specific contaminants? Do they describe risks to soil, water, or exposed surfaces more clearly? Second, how quickly do the visible conditions improve? Does the smoke dissipate? Do reports of dark rainfall continue? Do hospitals or relief agencies report a rise in respiratory complaints? Third, does the political language change? Do officials keep describing these as military fuel sites? Or does international concern grow over the environmental and civilian consequences? Those answers will tell us whether this was a single dramatic incident or the beginning of a larger pattern. Because once fuel and environmental systems become part of a conflict, escalation gets harder to contain. One strike can affect air, another can affect water, another can affect transport, another can affect fuel access for ordinary households. At that point, the map of war starts overlapping with the map of daily life almost completely. And that is when societies feel under siege, even far from the front line. There's also a moral clarity that cuts through all the propaganda here. People in cities should not have to guess whether the sky is safe. Families should not have to wonder whether the rain on their balcony is carrying soot and chemical residue. Teachers, drivers, engineers, and children are not abstract collateral in a targeting matrix. They are the people who breathe the result. That does not require taking every official claim at face value. It does not require endorsing every label used by either side. It simply requires acknowledging the obvious. When fuel storage burns over a major city, civilians inherit the consequences immediately. That is what the footage from Tehran shows. That is what the resident testimonies point to. And that is why the story resonates. Because beneath all the military language, it is about something basic. What happens when a city's air stops feeling normal? The answer is that fear spreads faster than smoke. People start improvising their own safety rules. They rely on group chats, videos, relatives, rumor, and instinct. Some stay indoors, some leave, some downplay it, some panic. And in that vacuum, trust becomes almost as important as cleanup, which is why the information battle now matters nearly as much as the environmental one. If authorities over-reassure, people may stop believing them. If they overstate without evidence, they deepen panic. If they say too little, rumors fill the space. The most useful response is the hardest one. Clear, limited, evidence-based guidance while the full assessment is still developing. That is not dramatic, but it is what cities need in moments like this. And for viewers outside Iran, there is one final point worth keeping in mind. It is easy to treat a story like this as just another shocking chapter in a distant war. Black smoke, burning fuel, damaged depots, alarming headlines. Scroll, react, move on. But infrastructure strikes are rarely local in meaning. They tell us how modern wars are being fought. They show how quickly the line between military target and civilian consequence can blur. And they remind us that once environmental contamination enters the picture, the damage is no longer measured only by the blast. It is measured by what people carry home on their clothes, by what settles on their cars, by what they breathe on the drive back, by whether they trust the next rainfall, by whether a city of millions feels like itself the next morning. So, when you hear the phrase black rain over Tehran, the strongest way to understand it is not as clickbait and not as prophecy. Understand it as a warning sign. A warning sign that this conflict has moved beyond immediate strikes and into the atmosphere of civilian life itself. The smoke, the soot, the fear, the uncertainty, the debate over whether these attacks weaken a government or harden public anger, the concern about markets, the concern about health, the concern about what happens if this continues. That is the real story, not one dramatic image, a chain reaction, from fuel depots to fire, from fire to smoke, from smoke to fallout, from fallout to fear, and from fear to a much bigger question. How many more pieces of ordinary life can a city lose before the damage stops looking temporary and starts looking like the new normal?